God type stuff. Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies. Rivers and seas boiling.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes.
The dead rising from the grave.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Enough, I get the point.
Old Testament, Mr. Mayor. Real wrath of God type stuff.
Exactly.
Fire and brimstone coming down from the...
Welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of Team Tim. And pen testing, wrath of God, cats and dogs, all the things. Hey, I'm Tim Golden, founder of Compliance Scorecard. Happy to be here with our great friends, Dylan and Teddy, Shield Cyber, talking not pen, but pen testing, right? And so, hey, Jesse, you're in the top right corner. Why don't you just say hello, hi, welcome.
Hey everyone, welcome to Team Tim, our local Friday live stream for all things cybersecurity. My name is Jesse Miller. I'm the founder of Power PSA Consulting. We help MSPs scale vCISO and cyber programs and do that profitably.
Awesome. You know what? And I just want to make sure we're up and running on LinkedIn because I got a little bit of a message here. And while I'm doing that, we'll put Mr. Schnurr up over here too. So
what's going on? Welcome back. Tim Schnurr, Inquisitive IT. I do some vCISO work, managed IT in the New York's tri-state area for financial services firms, law firms, and some startups. So if you're looking for anything that's talked about on the show, shifting left and getting ahead of cybersecurity, certainly reach out. But excited for this episode. Teddy and I have been chatting for a couple weeks here on talking about Pentester, or at least I think the flavor, it's a little different with Teddy and Dylan do. So this should be interesting.
All right. Hey, Teddy, since he mentioned you next, come on up. Say hello.
Hello. Tim Schnurr, I hope you're recovering okay from that earthquake today. Excited to be here to talk pen testing. I've been performing pen tests for the better part of a decade now. Building a piece of software that comes out of that as well to help organizations find those flaws before they become a real problem. Love talking about it, offensive security, the whole community, everything like that. So always open to chat and go deeper into these things.
Awesome. Thank you. And then Mr. Dylan, you are next, my friend.
Thanks for having me, guys. Really excited about the conversation. I always like to tell people I got my start in cyber on the pen testing side, then quickly realized how much I hated writing reports. So jumped over to the sales side instead, a lot less report writing.
Awesome. All right. So, Mr. Tim, let me make sure I'm rearranged here. We're going to put Mr. Jesse up in the middle, kind of get us down here. There we go. All right. We got the Brady Bunch going on. So why don't we just dive right in? Can we start? Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I can kick it off. So I had a quick LinkedIn just post talking about Teddy, and he's talking about a little bit of his experience. Like, he's been involved in pen tests for, I don't know, probably a good 10 years here. And some of them are really easy, right? Some of these companies, it's one move, two moves, three moves, and you're in full control. Data, very little siloing, full data access to whatever you want. And then there are other firms that are clearly doing all the right things that are very difficult, if not impossible, to get into. So I thought this would be a great episode. Teddy, Dylan can really talk about their experience here and talk about what are some of the big gaps and some of the obvious gaps that people need to take care of. So. Tim, why don't we start with that, right? And that's I think that's a very loaded term, a pen test. So.
It is, but I think it makes sense to set the stage for what it is that we're going to get into here. And I think for the first way to start it, though, is that people talk about pen tests, and they're usually defaulting to, maybe a network pen test, or like the idea behind this is that penetration tests can apply to any type of scope. So traditionally, right, people think of pen tests as internal, external pen tests, usually external. Web applications go in there, mobile applications are in there, right? Physical pen tests, there's things like that. So across the board, pen testing is really all about the scoping, right? And how you're going to define that scope and what are those rules of engagement that you're going to get into. But to define pen test as a whole, right? It's really, people would say breaking into a network or breaking into an environment or something like that. But I would want to change that to testing controls that are currently in place to determine their validity, how well they're working, and their efficacy at that. So, and that's something we're going to get into is really breaking down when it makes sense to do a pen test and when it doesn't. And that's, Tim, to your question or your earliest point there is we're going to get to that where when does it not make sense to do a pen test because it's so easy to get into. So yeah, that's how I would define it, right? It's testing your controls, their efficacy of those, and determining where those gaps could be. So don't do a pen test before you know where those are.
So I have another follow-up to that, and one that I would like to maybe just nail down a bit more. I know kind of where it sits in my mind, but what makes a pen test versus a vulnerability scan? Or because you see a lot of marketing fluff out there where automated pen tests or click button pen tests, and you dig into that and it's either they're throwing a bunch of scripts against the wall with Metasploit or Corelight or something else. How do you see, Teddy, what's the break line between what makes a real pen test and what are some key hallmarks of that?
Yeah, I mean, as part of that scoping process, you're thinking, what are the objectives of this, right? A real pen test is part of, the real value of a pen test comes in the scoping aspect of everything. So if you're scoping and you're like, okay, my objective is I'd like to see if you can gain access to global admin in Azure, right? Or I want you to get access to PII. Where a lot of these one-click type of, the automated pen tests, and they're good as a security tool, but they're not a real. I wouldn't consider them a real penetration test, right? You're not testing against an objective. You're testing against a set of controls. And yeah, so Tim, scoping is totally key. It's breaking down what are the goals and objectives of a pen test before you're getting into that. Now, when you're talking about, there are tools out there that go much farther than what people would traditionally say, like a Nessa scan pen test, which we're still working through in the industry to get past. So our consulting company, Hoplite, we lose deals because due to price all the time. Like there's no hiding that. Like it's very clear, and we're fine with that. We always try to make it very clear, but it's very difficult for people to compare apples to apples from pen test to pen test because there isn't a standard out there. There's nothing that says like this means that you can do a pen test. There's really not. I mean, there's a P-test framework, which is what most people use, but even still, so then people don't understand that, and then they'll just be like, "Oh, well, this person's price was a third of your cost, and then they're spending $7,000 on a vulnerability scan." That's going to give them something that they could have just bought the tool and done it for a year instead.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to circle back because in the compliance world we talk a lot about scoping and boundary, right? And so for those listening in the audience, right, whether it's a penetration test or an engagement in red team, blue team, or a compliance, engagement, like really having that defining, like, this is what we're doing. This is the rules of engagement. These are the products, services, APIs, people, process. These are the things that we're doing this work against, right? I hear a lot from, MSPs trying to do work in the Department of Defense, and you talk to those Department of Defense companies, and they're like, everything. We want our whole company. Yeah, but that's probably not the actual right scope. Right. When I look at our platform or we look at any of those other platforms, I'm going to want to have Teddy and Dylan go after my APIs, go after both authenticated and not authenticated, and go after the public facing website, go after the DNS servers, put those things in scope appropriately. Right. Yeah. So scoping is probably the biggest misconception in a penetration world, in a compliance world, and even in a risk world, right? And talking about peer group the other day, like defining an area of risk. They just had a huge earthquake, right? And where Tim's at in that area. And like, I don't experience earthquakes, so it's not a risk that I would have, but I probably want to make sure things are locked down. So the whole conversation around scoping and getting that right is extremely important, because as you said, Dylan, I can buy a tool and scan all my stuff, but is that authenticated, not authenticated, all of that thing. So scoping is really a big, important part.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a great model that you just mentioned, scoping, right? So a lot of times I think the misconception is I go out and hire a red teamer, or someone from DEF CON or someone to come in and basically just get in, right? Like, but did you actually go and check all those controls, right? Like, you found one way in, but is there 100 ways in? Have you gone through, Tim, I guess the word is more like audit, right? Like, have you gone through and validated, as Teddy said, the efficacy of those controls? So I think that adds a lot of color and a lot of value, like going through and actually pushing on every surface to figure out where there's weakness. So yeah, Dylan, go. I know you're waiting to go. So
no, I'm good. No,
I was just say,
Tim,
you make a good point there in distinguishing the difference between red teaming and penetration testing, right? A red teamer may perform a penetration test, or you may do full on red teaming, right? Where that's how we view it is when we sign up for a red team, it's no rules. How are you getting in? Obviously, there's some rules of engagement, but like for the most part, you can send emails, you can go break in physically. You can, whatever you need to do to gain that initial access, you can use Wi-Fi, like whatever you need to do to gain that initial access, and then pivot through to get access to whatever it is that those objectives are. Whereas a penetration test is much more stringent, when we're going through, we're deciding, okay, this is in scope, these systems are in scope, these are out of scope because these are maybe medical devices, they could be, but when you do each one of those depends very greatly on what you've done in the past and what you've gotten there. If you go to someone you've never gotten a pen test done, your controls are iffy, you don't remember when your last risk assessment was, and you're like, I want to hire a red teamer, it is an absolute, like, it's a joke. Like it's and to your point, it's like, yeah, we'll find a way in to get to that objective, and then the client's like, that's all that they're getting as value, because that's what they paid for. They paid for us to capture an objective, not to go through and evaluate the efficacy of all of these different types of controls. Yeah. So, yeah, Tim, you just threw something up as a question there. Was humans ever
Dylan, would you love to take this one?
Right? So yeah, right. Piggybacking, following people, tailgating into buildings, sending emails, making phone calls, things like that. Those are all things that come into play. They could come into play as a part of a siloed type of red team engagement, or a siloed type of pen test engagement, or as part of a red team that just like, hey, we want you to see if you can gain access to our treasury systems. Is one that we've done in the past. That's like, I don't care what you do around the country, go to all of our different locations, but can you gain access to this thing? But we don't want to know about it. And then you report back when you're done.
So go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, if I can jump in real quick, one of my favorite things when talking to small, mid-sized businesses is when they've gotten quotes. Tim, you talked about this a little bit earlier. They've gotten quotes from red teamers at DEF CON for $50,000, $60,000, $80,000 for a pen test. And I'm like, yeah, pen test, I'd love to have one. I need one for compliance. Just can't fit it into the budget. And that's where Teddy was talking about the power of scoping. You may not need a full, black box red team pen test. Let's go after, one connection. Let's try to go after one path of attack. That's where the power of scoping really comes in, so we can right size the engagement for those SMBs.
Yep. And I think that's where I had a question in the green room. I'll bring that out now, Dylan. Like, so CIS controls, right? So like pen testing is 1 through 18, it's 18, right? It's dead last. So I'm sure you kind of hear the objection of like, what's the point of pen testing? I think you've opened the door a little bit on the value, right? Like if everything's in scope and you're testing, it sounds like it's more, it can be almost like a walkthrough of a gap assessment or a risk assessment, which is very early in the process, which if everything's in scope, there's a lot of value there, I think, as opposed to being, hey, let's see if you can get in. And it's like, it's like me guarding an NFL receiver. Like, it's a joke. Like,
You would do great, I promise.
Without training, we think you could, but you have to train.
Yeah. How many ways am I going to
Absolutely.
get beat? Right. Yeah.
No, so on that, and I don't know if they did this by design, putting it at 18 dead last, but it's a conversation that we have all the time. If you don't have proper security controls in place, you don't test things on a regular basis, a penetration test might not be the right investment at this point in time. You might need a vulnerability management program. You might need a compliance assessment, risk assessment to build that program, build that framework so that down the line, maybe 12, 18 months later, a pen test would be right for you. But a pen test isn't the right thing at the right time for any given organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important. That's important because you touched on something, and that I was thinking about as we were talking is a risk register and actually understanding what the critical systems are to the business. And if we have identified critical systems and we feel reasonably comfortable that we have controls in place, then is a good time to test those controls and actually make sure that they're providing the efficacy that we believe they're providing, right? So I think that's a really important frame to look at it through.
Mm-hmm.
And what's that acronym? I know it well because I've been taking this risk management test all month.
Yeah, so I just broke my own rule of putting up a comment of an acronym without actually defining the acronym, which is business impact analysis. Jesse, we were just talking about that in my peer group yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And risk register and that stuff. So Dylan.
What's a risk register? I think we talk about that term all the time, and it's obviously this mythical. Tool.
I call it the Amazon shopping cart of risk, right? So, but I want to obviously stay on topic, right? Because we tend to circle the drain sometimes. So I'm a SaaS company, right? I know as part of my compliance thing, I need to do a pen test. Yeah, I'm scanning my code. I'm doing vulnerability scanning on my code base, on my machines, on my stuff. I think I'm covered. Okay, I need to fit this compliance or this, framework or this insurance or this thing. And they ask, do you do a pen test? Yeah, I run Nmap. I'm good. No. So we
that
talked
was my
about
question, right?
Right. We talked about scoping. I think the last 17 minutes or so, we've kind of gotten our head around, all right, get the scope right. So, are we doing the entire football stadium, or are we just looking at the defense, the offense, or the coaches, right? Mm-hmm. Scoping. All right, great. Now we're just going to go after the offense, right? Or the coaches. We've defined the scope. So now what? Where do I go? What do I do? Do I since you're living and breathing this stuff all day, every day, far better than us, what is the next part of this process, right? Scoping and boundary, step one, in a sense. Where do we go from here?
Yeah. That's when key communication starts. So you want to make sure, right, before you're testing anything, first of all, you want to be testing, depending on the scope, right? So in an application specifically, we would opt to test in a QA or a staging type of environment. You don't usually want to test anything like that in production data, real people actually using stuff. You want to get into a pre-production environment, and then it's gathering credentials. It's gathering. So the way that we would look at something like that is we would look from a black box perspective. We would look at the login page. Can we bypass authentication somehow? And that's what we call an uncredentialed or unauthenticated test. We do all of our testing there, and then we would move to, okay, now we need credentials. And we'd use those credentials to then verify, to explain the risk of whether someone's credentials were compromised, or if there's some apps where people can just sign up, right? So you bypass authentication wall, but then there's all these other risks that are there behind that. So can you horizontally pivot or vertically pivot? Meaning horizontally, meaning can I access me as a user of your platform? Can I access Tim Schnurr's tenant? How can I bypass that? Or vertically, can I, me access Tim Golden's super admin tenant? And how do we? Authorization is a huge part in application security that's often overlooked, and that's why companies kind of get screwed when they buy a pen test and someone just goes and runs a burp scan on their environment, where it's, oh, here's your SQL injection that's a time-based Boolean SQL injection that is actually a false positive because Burp Suite can't actually pick up on those things. Or there's a lot of things that it doesn't pick up on at all. It's a great tool, like anything else. Tool is good, but you also need the proper people operating those tools on the back end to understand other types of gaps and flaws that are there. So, and again, this is for web applications and APIs and stuff like that, specifically separate than a network pen test, what most people would usually refer to. But yeah, that's how we look at it. But then you got to be constant communication when we're starting testing in the morning, when we're finishing testing in the afternoon. Some people want us to test at nights. So when we're starting testing in the evening and finishing in the morning, and then you keep having those conversations, weekly status meetings. Always, 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 you should be getting notifications if there's anything critical. Right? If anything that's dropped dead, you should have numbers. You should have phone numbers and emails, and that should be discussed immediately when something like that.
Who to call checklist?
Yeah.
So I want to click in on that drop dead, and Tim, I know you've got a question about the same thing.
Yeah. So I mean, the question, I think I started the show talking about like, what are the easy gaps to fill, right? Like, so how do we know we got a rookie on the field and the wide receiver is just going to dust them, right? So like, what are some of the easy things? And it sounds like we're talking about what's at scope, and we're talking about efficacy of controls, just to kind of hammer down that theme here. So even in risk assessment, Jesse, like from a VCSO perspective, like, what are you trying to unearth there? And it's interesting because Teddy just talked about a lot of like very technical things. And I think a lot of people that sign up for pen tests, like, wouldn't know what an API is even, right? Like, so, it seems like they don't have the knowledge to understand what's in scope and what's not in scope,
Right.
Which, so go ahead.
I mean, to me, it was kind of leading into, and kind of where I was going with my question on, we've talked about, the guys from Black Hat that are charging you $50,000-$60,000, or there's organizations that will do that. I'm not going to name names, but that I've worked with in the past, and they're great pen testing teams. But it's a $50,000-$60,000 engagement. It's over the course of 3 months. They do low and slow, emulating hacker attacks and all that kind of stuff, and that definitely has a place. But then there's a flip side of that where, oh yeah, I'm just going to go buy Cobalt, right? It's got all my pen tests preloaded. You give me your application, your APIs. I'm going to click button, execute it, and come back to you and be like, yeah, $10,000, we'll test your application. I click button, test it, and give you the Cobalt report and say, oh yeah, there you go, pen test done, check the box compliance, right? So I think what Tim was getting at is, what are some things to look for? Because I wouldn't call that a pen test. I mean, maybe technically it is, but there's not much value there. So what are some things to look for a pen tester that actually knows what they're doing and is doing more than just running scripts or attacks from a platform against your environment?
Yeah.
Dylan, you want to take that? Or
I was going to say, this is where my knowledge would stop, because when I got my start in the pen testing, it was script kiddie, to the max. So this is where I'm here to learn from Teddy.
Script kiddie turned head of channel. Yeah, so that's where, and that it truly does go back to scoping, right? And that scoping should go well before the proposal or any contracts are signed, right? You should be talking to different firms and really interviewing. The problem is sometimes people don't have the right questions to ask to understand the difference. Now, I would say big red flags are if there's like, yeah, well, we look at the OAuth top 10 and that's what we do, right? Or if they just, if their value prop is their tools or something like that, big red flag. Specifically for web app testing, that is a very niche, like good web app testers. They're very, very few and far between. And you want them to actually go into their methodology and the stuff they're looking for. I would always looking for authorization errors. That's like the biggest thing right now and then we see that we bypass so many controls, or so many apps. We gain access to things that we shouldn't because of authorization. And there's always companies that are like, oh, we've gotten pen tests the last 6 or 7 years. And it's like, let's see those reports. And then you look into them and it's like, there was no vertical or horizontal pivoting being checked for there.
So what you're telling me as a SaaS vendor, I just can't go grab the community edition of Burp Suite and be done and check that box on my SOC 2 and ISO. Ran Burp Suite, got a report, greens everywhere. I'm good to go. I'm secure. I think that's really the question is, I got some green check boxes on some tools and I'm secure. Yeah. Like maybe, Dylan or Teddy or Jesse or any one of you, like, talk about that for a few minutes, right? I ran a tool. I got some check boxes. I'm secure. Really?
So let me start with that. And it goes back to the whole, problem with the industry calling vulnerability scans pen tests, because by definition, and we've heard this time and time again, a penetration test is an objective-based custom assessment, not a hey, let's go touch everything we can and throw out a couple yeah, exactly, the $99 pen test. Let's throw out some green check boxes and you're all good, because you've got skilled testers that can go, no, I can just screw up all of this authentication and get access to every database ever. So it's important to draw the line in the sand of what is a scan, what is an actual test, because testing is all validation and exploitation. So Teddy, I'll throw it over to you there, but wanted to draw that line.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's like anything else, being successful in something like that is going to always require a combination of people, process, and technology. And ultimately, the technology that you have may be a good scanner, maybe something like that, but it's not going to look for everything that you need to find. So, yeah, that's kind of how I would break it down is making sure that the firm that you're working with have the right tools, making sure that they have the right people, and that they're following the right process to lead it to a successful test. It sounds like it's more than it is, because a lot of it's just, for a lot of testers that are, really good testers, it's just back of the hand, but they should be able to answer any of those questions very confidently and know, exactly what they're doing, tell you exactly what they're doing.
So what do you feel like the biggest risks, I guess, like, I'm just trying to back it up from an MSP or a small business. What are like assuming you weren't going through and checking, as I said, like the weakness of the efficacy of each control, like what are some of the areas that are drastically, like, I guess, underprotected or overlooked, or, the easy kind of like the most danger, right? Like what's going to hit them with ransomware like tomorrow?
Yes. All right. So on the topic of ransomware, then let's pivot over to infrastructure and network pen tests then. So the biggest thing is misconfigurations, right? It's everyone's worried about CVEs here, CVEs there, things like that. And yes, and a lot of these do end up falling into like the CIS benchmark misconfigurations and some of that. I know some people think like that's a compliance checkbox, but there's a lot of those things in there that like are very important to us. So for example, if you're talking like once an attacker is on the network, the first thing that they're going to look for if they're trying to bypass EDR or bypass any sort of detection mechanism is we're going to look for standard network traffic that's going on right now. We're going to look for credentials that are stored in file shares that everyone can access. We're going to look for NetBIOS. We're going to look for LLMNR. We're going to look for MDNS. We're going to look for IPv6, right? Those different types of protocols that broadcast, credentials. And what we do is we capture those credentials. We either crack them or we can relay them on to another misconfiguration, which would be SMB signing in this situation. So those are, I think we get in with that almost every time. Once we get in, once you bypass external and you get into internal, it's very easy to do that because Microsoft has made the mistake of enabling a lot of these things from default from the very get-go. So that's where it's like you can't just depend on Microsoft to have, it's a brand new operating system. It's not going to have any vulnerabilities on it. No, like that's those are things that are very, very important. And so, again, like I said, all those things that I just mentioned there, none of those was a single CVE, which that's the common misconception is that people think, like it's all these vulnerabilities that are out there. And it's like, really, no, the widespread attacks, those are all come from misconfigurations.
Yeah.
Would it help? I mean, it's almost like there should be a CVE for a Microsoft misconfiguration. I guess I'm overlapping a little bit here, but it's like,
Well,
how do we kind of make it obvious that that's like a problem? I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, it's a good point, and I'm going to take this time to talk about like kind of what was the whole purpose of Shield. Was we spent time, thousands and thousands of pen tests. We find the same things over and over again. We get the same feedback from people saying we run Qualis scans every week or Nessus scans, and it's like, it doesn't matter how many scans you run or how many patches you fix. Like, if you don't understand the context of how all that stuff fits into your environment, then there's no point in doing it. You're playing whack-a-mole for nothing. So you should take misconfigurations, and CVEs are a problem too. It's a lot of times how you gain initial access, but it's not how widespread attacks are happening. So you have CVEs, you've got misconfigurations, and you've got the identity layer, which is how a lot of people are pivoting through internal networks. That's how ransomwares happen, things like that. So it's a combination of all of those things, and how do you bring context up to the user to know, okay, this CVE, this misconfiguration, this misconfigured identity can result in a very, very big problem. And that's the kind of context that we're trying to bring to people instead of looking at them all in siloed, not understanding how they all fit.
Yeah.
Right. It's the Sun Tzu quote that says, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. That's what it is,
Yes.
right?
Exactly. Dylan, let's make sure Sam writes that somewhere on our website.
Yep.
Awesome. So, as we're about halfway through here, I kind of want to throw some stuff out to the audience. As we've talked about penetration testing, scoping, boundary, the rookie on the field versus the experts like the Teddy and the Dylans, right? Kind of keeping that in mind. For those listening, in the chat below, give us a thumbs up or a yes if you've actually done more than an automated scan for a pen test. If you've actually engaged with the smart people like Teddy and Dylan and others, have you done a penetration test as defined somewhat by CIS? Have you done this? In the comments, give us a yes, no, like, or some indication, please.
Yeah. I'm thinking more about what you were talking about the configurations and like LLMNR being like one of the major ones you always see, right? It's like new domain controller, new breach. It's so, to your point, Tim. But back when I was working at an MSP and we were building our security program, and that was one of the things we always basically pushed as part of the risk assessment was an AD hardening, which was LLMNR, among other things, getting that done. And that was it was one of the things that was harder to sell, to be frank, because the client's like, why do I need this? But then when you talk to that, what you're saying is this is how attackers get in, vulnerability management. Like, I might say if you have to choose between that and your standard like Nessus scan, you should do the AD hardening first, right? But yeah, and that's what's nice about Shield. I'm not, I don't want to pitch you guys too hard, but that's what I think. Yeah, I know. I'll plug you. is that you guys are looking at the attack path and the attack chain and the actual how or the pragmatic way attackers are getting access to the environment. So I just think it's really important for people watching to understand that if you want to get some mileage on easy, low-hanging fruit to do with your customers, go do some AD hardening and best practices. I saw Zach from Sention pop in there with a comment, and obviously they do a great job with doing some hardening against that as well. But I think it's so important for people to understand that, and that everyone obsesses about vulnerability management. And yes, it's important, right? But only in the right frame with the right perspective.
Yeah, I always describe this that like you can, like humans, most of us have like moles on our body, right? You can live with moles; they're fine until they become a problem, right? And that's why you get them. That's why you're continuously evaluating them. It's the same thing until it becomes an issue where it's cancerous or something like that. It's fine to live with it. You may remove it because it may become an issue at some point in time. But that's the risk that your doctor is making with you. It's the same thing with vulnerabilities. Like you should not. I'm not saying you shouldn't. This isn't. But you don't have to worry about fixing every low and medium and even high.
Right.
Like there's high and critical vulnerabilities that are not exploitable. There's not a big problem right now. It's not something you have to create a big issue for but you want to make sure you're targeted about it. So we're trying to bring let's bring 80-20, the 80-20 principle to security and vulnerability management and, preventing attacks.
So Tim, yeah, I can ask that. So a lot of MSPs, I look at thousands of them. Tim does as a vendor, and Jesse is always looking at potential customers to work with, right? So the typical stack is kind of, the same things: MDR, MFA. I'd say application whitelisting probably isn't even common. There's a big channel vendor that starts with a T that does application whitelisting.
Yeah.
But these are
not in my stack locker.
Not your stack locker. Yeah. So compensating controls, right? Like you've got a out of the box Microsoft system that's not configured at all. Like how much do those help, right? Like how much do those can they compensate 100%, or you're still going to have your way just because they're wearing sunscreen?
So
Yeah.
I'm going to start on this one because I was at an MDR provider for a little over 5 years, and I've used Teddy and the team before I joined Shield for penetration test, and it always blew my mind how they were able to bypass different security controls, whether it was MDR or application whitelisting, whatever the case was. The reality is, when you look at those misconfigurations in the identity layer, it looks like real traffic. You're talking about bypassing EDR and other security controls. When you're acting as Dylan Hutchison and accessing systems that I may or may not access on a regular basis, a SOC that's inundated with thousands and thousands of alerts is not going to catch that, because it looks like Dylan accessing different systems. So that's one thing that I think is just tremendously, I guess, a misconception in the space is, I've got MDR, EDR, I'm protected from this. It's like if you're acting as a known user, you're not going to see it. So Teddy, I'll turn it over to you on how you've bypassed these. But I wanted to say that from the MDR side.
100% claims are effective. Go ahead, Teddy.
Yeah, well, I mean, those 100% claims and stuff like that, they come with a ton of little fine print there, right? But bypassing EDR and stuff like that, it happens. It's possible. We do it all the time. And just by changing what the hash would look like, which is what a lot of those things pick up on, that's as simple as it takes. I mean, now a lot of them are getting good where the heuristics will pick up on the changes and things like that. But even still, so those are talking about EDR technology specifically. But like I said before, they may pick up on us trying to exploit an actual vulnerability, but they're not going to pick up on us acting as normal users. And that's the whole goal of an attacker anyway. When you always hear people talk about by the time you find out that an attacker is in your environment, they've already been there for 6 or 7 months. It's probably true, right? They have access to credentials, and they're living there from credentials. They're not living there exploiting machines throughout the environment. They have credentials, and then they're slowly spidering their way through the network as they're gaining access to more and more users. And that's really the name of the game. It's seeing how many users you can gain access to until you get to a super high privileged user, and you can use that user then to deploy the ransomware or turn off EDR or MDR or something like that, right? So, I forget even what the question was there, but that's kind of how we do it. And it's to your point, they're great controls. They in everything about security is about in defense in depth. You need to have different layers of those things. I'd rather have both of them doing okay than having a super expensive solution that you think is going to do it.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's interesting because, it occurs to me, and you can tell me and I'm trying to think of pragmatic ways for MSPs and clients to vet good pen test providers, right? So what a good question, like a second or third level question, be to ask a potential provider is, how do you do, and what's your process for doing user emulation compromise techniques? Would that be something that if they maybe didn't know what they were doing, they might stumble, but if they kind of knew and they were a good pen tester, like, oh yeah, we do X, Y, and Z. We act like the users. This is what we do. This is how we get into the network. Question there would that be a good question to gauge maybe knowledge of a pen tester?
Yeah. Like are we going to evaluate the directory services? Are we going to evaluate Entra ID? Azure AD,
Right.
Active Directory, things like that. Like, are we going to go to that layer? I always view it as like you've got your identity layer, which is all at this plane, and then or the host base layer, which is this plane, but then the identity layer lives below that, and they have access to all these other things, right?
Right.
So I would 100%. That's got to be a part of the scope. If not, you're just running a vulnerability scan and performing exploits on it, which anyone can see whether or not a vulnerability has an exploit to it or not. It's available with CCF. So,
like I can go into a network and smash my way through getting on a computer and capturing LLMNR requests and cracking those and be like, yay, I dumped a hash, I got a password. I'm gonna make so much noise. Of course I'm gonna get caught, and they'll be like, yay, our SOC did our job. And I say, yeah, you just got a pen test, right? But that's not realistic. That's not how an hacker or an attacker works in the network, right?
And
So
that's
I want
also
to add.
you have a SOC, but go ahead, Dylan.
True. I want to add on that by telling the listeners out there, don't use a penetration test as a gotcha on your MDR provider, because going back to where we started with scoping, it goes on both sides. If your MDR provider is only really managing your EDR platform of choice, your flavor of choice, they're not going to have visibility into your O365 or your AD or any SaaS applications. So make sure that it's a collaborative discussion when you're doing your pen test with your MDR provider. Make sure they actually have visibility and access to what your pen tester's testing. So that way it's an actual productive engagement rather than throwing money against the wall.
That's actually a really good point, and I hadn't actually thought about that when I was. So I've been, dealing with scoping our own penetration, like real penetration tests, not some, burp suite that I'd run anyways. But, and I've engaged with about 4 different organizations to conduct our, own penetration testing, and I hadn't actually thought about that because, we have pieces of our stack. I won't call out, the tools or whatever that we use for EDR, MDR, SOC, and yada, yada, yada. But I hadn't actually thought of that. Like that whole concept of like, hey, we're going to do this thing with this organization to test these kinds of things in the scope. While we want you to be part of that conversation and not block them along the way, because maybe the SOC, maybe gets discovered on that initial access. And now the scope says we want to get beyond initial access. We want to get in and go change data. And so if I don't have that conversation with my SOC or my MDR or my EDR, and they don't know it, and they stop it dead in its tracks, which they should, then your engagement is done because I asked you to go change data someplace and prove it to me that you can, and you get stopped dead in your tracks. Well, if I didn't have that conversation with my MDR or my SOC or my other pieces of the stack, I would have wasted everybody's time. It's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that.
This is where it all comes down to. It's a journey. It's not going to happen overnight. And so we always recommend, and we talked about red teams earlier to kind of bring that back into it, but like you're doing your pen test early on, a ton of people should know about it. Your SOC should know about it. Your MSP should know about it. Your internal IT team should know about it. Your executive team should know about it. Okay, everyone knows we're being communicative throughout the whole process. Year 1, year 2, you start to maybe involve less people and things like that. But the whole point is early on, like if we're finding things, we're able to bypass MDR or EDR for certain aspects. The whole point is that we should be able to report back to them and help them fix that in the future. Where it's like, hey, no bad blood. We're just here to help you. And we do this a lot with different MSSPs and EDR providers. Is hey, you missed that. You should probably trigger an alert for when we change an Active Directory certificate. Like that happened just last week with a different client where we went back to their SOC to help them fix some configurations. And you're improving it. So then down the line, 3-4 years from now, maybe you omit the SOC from knowing. And then the idea is because we've worked through it, we've helped them like improve their controls. Now we want to see what happens in a true, black hat scenario. Can we bypass them at that point in time? But by trying to spring something on someone, you're not going to make anyone better for that. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so I guess that leads a question that I'm thinking of as you were talking. Where do you see the most types of what's the most popular or the most that you guys are doing? Is it like an assumed compromise pen test, or is it more that black hat scenario where we got to try and get a phishing email through and pop a shell and then work our way through? Or do you see mainly we're just doing assumed compromise, and that's probably the best way to help a SOC learn?
Yeah, so it just depends on how many years we've been working with that company.
Yeah, okay.
But early on, unless they can prove that they've done some mature things before from a pen testing perspective, we usually like to start them pretty early in the process.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but to your point, most like our default scope, if someone comes to me and says we want a pen test done, assuming they're not a SaaS provider, right? So if it's a SaaS company, the first thing we're going to jump our heads to is API and web app. That's where we're focused.
Right.
Most modern SaaS companies are all using, right? They have decentralized networks. We're not concerned about ransomware pivoting through their entire network. We're worried about their application data that sits behind it. So if it's a SaaS company, immediately let's look through your apps, your APIs. Okay. If it's a traditional company that's got a more traditional infrastructure, then we're thinking internal, like assumed breach, internal pen test, but then also an external, so from the outside in as well.
Gotcha. Okay. That's helpful.
So the other thing that I find interesting, right, because, we're scoping and doing all that stuff, right? I deliberately excluded my M365 from scope because it doesn't actually touch the SaaS. And while it touches the 3 or 4 humans in the organization, out of scope, right?
Yep.
I'm not writing code. Our salespeople's not writing code. They're not in the platform doing the things, out of scope, right? Now, as a company as a whole, I probably should be going after my staff in 2FA and my M365 down the road. And this is where, Teddy, you were talking about that long-term relationship with an organization like Shield or Blackpoint or whoever the others are in the space. I'm not going to go after M365 today because I don't really care. I do, but what I care more about as a SaaS provider, can you get in my thing? Can you break it? Can you change data? Right? So as we're kind of winding down here, into like the last 10 or 15 minutes, I know we had a whole boatload of things in the green room we talked about a little bit about like, what are the first couple of moves? So, you mentioned misconfigurations, right?
Yep.
Anything else there, maybe Teddy or Dylan, you want to kind of pop in that we might have missed?
Yeah. So I mean, like a tough one, that you're just like right out of the box, you're like, these guys are good. Like they've got their shop in order. Like it sounds like misconfigurations are a big one. What else, like in terms of, missing gaps in the CIS, 1 through 17 there?
Yeah. I always like to explain to people, like if I could leave you with a couple of things to do, it would be, have MFA enabled externally everywhere, right? So every application you can that's going to have access to your network for anything sensitive, have MFA, some sort of SSO, something like that enabled. After that, if you're a traditional on-prem network or something like that, have long passwords, longer than 14 characters. Anything below that, we can usually crack in less than a day. Once it gets higher than that, it gets too expensive, and most people are not going to be motivated enough to spend $1,000 cracking a password. It would also be having like a specific CIS control, having SME signing required. That's like
what is that? For those of us in the back, SME. What is that?
SME
Subject
signing.
matter expert signing. Like, yeah, come sign my book. SME.
Server message block signing. So basically, SMB is a protocol that we can communicate. That's how we authenticate on the back end to traditional like Active Directory environments and stuff like that. So if you have that enabled and we're trying to authenticate from a machine that's not on the network, that doesn't have a certificate on that network, it's not going to allow us to do it. Or it's not going to allow us to relay credentials from an unknown machine that the source hash didn't come from to another machine.
So I remember rolling out like a year or 2 or 3 or 5 ago, like SMB1.x, like go run this PowerShell script to block this on every machine so you don't blah, 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 right? So, yeah.
But there's like, there are minimal things you can do that when I talk about the 80-20 principle is like a big thing for us. when we talk with Shield and stuff like that, because it's like, just do these main things, and I promise you, like, you're doing more than 99% of other people.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you're just trying to look at, you don't want to be that last gazelle running across the prairie, right? Like,
Yeah.
As a small business, like, what's the risk reward? So how do you make them unattractive?
Yep.
80-20 rule, as you said. So that's good stuff. Tim, do you want to, we got a couple minutes here. Maybe we won't go over this time. We can go into final thoughts. That really, this is great, Teddy and Dylan, like, in terms of what's the value of a pen test. Because I think a lot of times when I think of a pen test, I'm like, well, I'm not there yet. My house is in order. My controls aren't in order. How can a pen test add value if it's done kind of like maybe somewhat out of order? But as you said, what's in scope is really what defines a real pen tester, maybe like a vulnerability test. What other layers, like, are you dealing with just vulnerabilities? Are you actually dealing with, like, to emulate threats and understand how they act and move horizontally, as you said? So, yeah, Tim, key takeaways, I guess. We'll
So as we try to wrap up here in the last 8 to 9 minutes, you know how we always like to leave the show with our MSP listening audience with a couple of key takeaways, right? And so since Dylan, you're in the top corner, you get to be brought up first, and then Teddy, you're up next. So take away from an MSP perspective, have at it.
Yeah, I'm glad to go first because I was really worried you guys were going to take mine. We talked about them earlier. The CIS controls are there for a reason. You talk about getting that step 0 to step 1 in terms of a security framework. Use it to your advantage. It'll put you ahead of 99% of other organizations.
Awesome. And I think if I'm doing this correctly, then Teddy, you're up next.
Yeah. So I have two. One of them longer than the other. The other one, second one's simple. The first one is, and I can say this just having a penetration testing company. Do not think that going and get a penetration test done is going to be like an all-encompassing thing that's going to find all of your gaps and your flaws, and you're all of a sudden going to be good and you don't have to worry about cyber hygiene. I look at a pen test and the whole process as, think about it like a college class, right? You don't take the final on the first day and then try to learn everything after, right? You go to class, you take quizzes, you go to office hours, you study, you do homework, you do all these things throughout the entire semester or the entire year. And then at the end, you take your final. And so all those things you're doing before are the first 17 controls in CIS, right? Let's make sure we have our asset management down. Let's make sure we're scanning for vulnerabilities. Let's make sure we have all these. Let's make sure we have all these things fixed before we go, because we know there's going to be a problem. So do all those things. Then the penetration test, think of it as your final. So just be prepared for it. Don't sit there and be concerned about it. Know that you've put in the work, and then you're going into that thing and you're going to have it, and it's going to look well. The one easy, simple one, do not overlook the identity layer. That's my main thing. Don't overlook the identity layer from an attack surface perspective.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Dr. Jesse, I know you always have a lot of great key takeaways.
I'm going to go back to my quote, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And so I think that building off of what Teddy and Dylan have said, but understanding what you want to accomplish with the pen test, and then also having a control, to speak in scientific terms, of the way you evaluate your pen test providers. Understand what you want to get done, understand what makes a real pen test and what makes a good pen test, and then build some control questions and some control evaluations to find that right fit for compliance, number one, but then also for getting some security leverage out of that as well.
Awesome. And I don't know if it's my internet or something, but I'm getting a little lag. Mr. Tim, you're up next, my friend.
Yeah, I hope I'm not lagging, but I think, just looking at a strategy of how to protect your company. You talked first about, we talked about using MDR and using application whitelisting, trying to use tools to kind of shortcut that or short circuit that. Like, clearly that's failing, right? And a good pen tester can get around that. So table stakes is like, you still need to do hygiene. You still need to go through all those CIS controls, authentication, configurations. There's 256 maybe something like that. Windows configurations and CIS Windows configurations recommendations. So just on that first recommendation that Dylan and Teddy talked about in terms of what you need to do, something you need to focus on, right? Which is Tim Golden, I think it's Control 4 is configurations. Maybe it's 5, but you can't work backwards. You can't just like, I'll get a pen test and like I'll go correct those 3 things and think that you're fine, which is not going to be the case. Is really what Teddy said. You've got to kind of work up the whole body of work. You can't go from totally unprotected to doing a pen test and working backwards. You got to work your way up as opposed to coming down. So
awesome. And I guess I probably should go. My key takeaway. Let me think about this for a second.
I know you learned something, Tim. So that was good. You got to coordinate and orchestrate the pen test, which I think that was a little bit of light bulb for you. Yeah.
Like I'm trying to coordinate all the moving parts here on the live stream. So So I guess my key takeaway would be communication is key, right? All the way from the top stakeholder to your SOC to your MDR, right? As you're doing these kinds of things, as you're trying to meet not only your compliance checks, but good cyber hygiene and really good security, make sure that you're communicating that effectively across the entire organization and the departments in which this stuff will be touching, right? As both Dylan and Teddy pointed out, there may be parts of the engagement that you don't want to tell the SOC because you're trying to test the SOC, or you do want to tell the SOC so that they can capture that and allow that traffic through. Communication is the key part of this, right? Being able to effectively engage at all levels across the organization. So we've got just a few seconds left. I'm going to kind of pull this up here. I haven't done this. We haven't done this in the past with a kind of call to action. Where do we go? I thought I'd throw this out there, see what the audience, if they jump at it, like Dylan, Teddy, I'm assuming head over to shieldcyber.io. Is there anything else that we should probably let the audience know about engagement and that kind of stuff? Some kind of call to action.
How about power grid thing too, right? Get them all right there.
Well, you stole one. Let me finish the one. You get to the other.
I think we're moving on.
I'll do a special. We'll do an impromptu special offer for the listeners. If you reach out to us, just let us know that you met us from the Team Tim podcast, and we can get you an identity security assessment, complimentary of the team here.
Awesome.
Wow. Wow.
Tim Golden's paying for it.
Tim Golden. Covered by Tim Golden. No, just kidding.
I got nothing on this. Coffee? Look, even my coffee mug's not branded with my stuff. So
we'll offer everybody a pen test.
There you go. All right. With the last, minute and a half, I really am excited to, give our good friend Jesse a minute and a half to talk about Power Grid. Right. So jump on in.
Okay. Hopefully my video isn't lagging anymore, but if it is, too bad. Power Grid is kind of the vision that I've come up with from this year and a half of working with MSPs and seeing some consistent needs in the community in terms of being able to properly structure and scale vCISO services. We're getting to a tipping point where risk-led approaches are required. That strategy is required to make sure we're ensuring that our customers are safe. And many MSPs are just under-equipped to do that. So what the Power Grid is a community that has a deep ops training section and then templates, methodologies, and basically my career's worth of expertise helping to structure these programs for MSPs. So if you're looking to deploy a vCISO or security advisory practice for your MSP, this is where you want to be. It's extremely cheap right now to get started, and go over to powergrid.group to check it out. And that'll take you right to the info page, and you can read about what it's about and sign up.
Awesome. So I know we don't talk about plugging ourselves, but I really felt the need to be able to bring forward to the community what Jesse's doing with Power Grid, what he's doing with not just Power Grid, but I believe you're doing some stuff with Empath Cyber, our good friends Wes and the rest of them over there. Head on over to, I just can't, where the heck did they? Oh yeah, there we go. I wanted to prop that up, right? So head on over to PowerGrid, powergrid.group. I know. I love the kind of like dumbed down or like I love it. So hey, it's 3:00. We're getting out of here. Everybody stay safe for those of you that were affected by the the earthquake and all of that. Stay safe. And we'll see you next week.
Next Friday.
Subscribe now.